Okay, Lewis and Clark had a tough time of it in the Bitterroot. I mean, in terms of their overall journey and the arduous nature of it, where does that fit on the scale of things? And what?
I wouldn't know how to answer on a scale of things. For Lewis and Clark, the most perilous time when they came the closest to losing everything, their lives, or at least all of their equipment, and then almost certainly their lives, was in the Bitterroot. And that stretch of the current state of Idaho that runs from Lemhi Pass upstream on the Lemhi River, and then over the divide, Triple Pass Divide, then down to Ross's Hole, then up the Bitterroot Valley, down the Bitterroot River, but up the valley to Traveler's Rest, and then the trip across the Bitterroot Mountains that took them September, October, November of 1805 was by far the most dangerous part of the whole trip.
The meeting was...
Now, why? You want to hear why it was dangerous, or go ahead?
Go ahead, no.
They didn't know where they were going. They had with them a guide, they called him Old Toby, who was a Shoshone, who had been once when he was a teenager. Now, we don't know how old he was, but something over 40 probably. They called him Old Toby. And he volunteered to lead them. He got lost by his own admission a couple of times on the course of doing that. At one time in the Bitterroots on the way back, George Dreyer, who was a member of the expedition and who was, in many people's opinion, including mine, the finest woodsman that North America ever produced, Dreyer told Lewis in the middle of the Bitterroots, "Captain, I'm lost. I can't find my way out of here, and I've been over this once." And they retreated back down to the Nez Perce and got Nez Perce Indian guides to take them over the mountains a second time. So they had an Indian guide when they crossed to the west, and they had an Indian guide when they crossed back to the east. It wasn't that bad in the Bitterroot. They were just going down the Bitterroot on the way out to California, or they were just going through the Bitterroot on the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And on the way back, Clark, who was the only one who went on the Bitterroot, went upstream on the Bitterroot until he got to the passes that led him out of Montana into Idaho, where again he had a very rough time. A lot of this country, nobody lives in it. And, I mean, you can go over it today. There's some logging roads in the Lolo Trail in the Idaho part of the Bitterroot Mountains. But that's all there is a few logging trails. And in much of the pass that comes out of Idaho into Montana that ends up at Ross's Hole where the Bitterroot starts, that Lewis and Clark came through, nobody lives there and there are no logging roads. This is the toughest mountain country there is in North America. And of course they had a lot of difficulty in getting through it. Another part of their difficulty was food. They did all right when they were in the Bitterroot Valley, but once they got up into the mountains going over the Lolo Trail out to the Nez Perce, all the game disappeared. In areas that today hunters pay thousands of dollars for an outfitter and for a license to go up and shoot an elk, there weren't any elk. They lived out on the prairie where the grasses were, and they were not in those mountains. So they came very close to starvation, very close to being totally lost and never being able to get out. So of course it was a very tough journey for them. And that's way more than you'll ever be able to use, but anyway, I've said it.
Let me just ask you a quick question on the Inca Chutes. What did the Inca Chutes think when they saw Lewis and Clark and this group sort of straggling up from what we now call Lost Trail Pass and into Ross's Hole?
What did they think?
What did they, when they saw this motley band?
What they thought is best summed up by talking to a threat that Lewis made to Camawee of the Shoshones on the other side of that pass, and that he carried with him, and they knew that he carried it with him. His threat was, if you don't help us, he needed horses from the Shoshones. If you don't help us and trade us some horses, no white man will ever come back to see you again. Now, to a modern ear, that sounds like they should have just thrown up their hands in total joy and said, whoopee, that's exactly what we want. That is not exactly what they wanted. And when the Indians in Montana saw them coming over Lost Trail Pass and coming down to Ross's Hole, what they saw was white men. And that meant rifles. That meant you could get your hands on gunpowder and on balls, and you could have rifles, and you could defend yourself against the Blackfeet, and you could go out onto the plains where the buffalo were and come back to your mountains for the winter time, but that you would be able to take on those goddamn Blackfeet who had a connection with the British, that gave them guns when the tribes in the mountain had no connection with any white men and they couldn't get a hold of any guns. That's number one, what those white men meant to the Montana Indians.
In terms of Lewis and Clark, without Salish horses, would that have been the end of the expedition?
Without Indians, generally, it would have been the end of the expedition. The Indians saved them at every step along the way. They fed them out at Fort Mandan in the winter of 04-05. They were the guides over the Lolo Trail in both directions. They were the ones who sold fish to Lewis and Clark when they were out on the Pacific, and they had horses. Lewis and Clark had traded with Cameweed's band of Shoshones for some horses. They had been cheated. The Shoshones had given them their outcast, their worst horses. Lewis and Clark didn't have any choice about it. And so they came with, I forget the exact number, but maybe it was 39 horses that they had when they came over the mountains out of Idaho back into Montana. When they first met the Montana Indians at Ross's Hole, who were willing to trade them for more horses and were willing to take some of the cast off from the Shoshone herds and trade good horses for them. And so, of course, they were critical to Lewis and Clark's success. Without those horses, they never could have gotten over the mountains, period.
What do you think that Lewis and Clark represented to the Salish? I mean, it was really the Lewis and Clark expedition in many regards was the the sounding bell of the eventual white domination. I mean, maybe they didn't, I mean, they couldn't see that.
No, of course they couldn't see that. And when they looked at Lewis and Clark, one of the very first things they saw was an Indian girl, teenager, with a baby in the cradle board on her back. And they knew this was not a war party. And they knew it because no war party ever went out with the women along with it. So that's the first thing that they noticed. The second thing they noticed, these guys all had rifles. They all had powder. They all had lead. And they badly needed horses. And so they were able to trade for some of these rifles that they so desperately wanted. Did Lewis and Clark represent to them what Americans of the later part of the 19th century would represent? These are the ones who are here to take our lands away from us. These are the ones that are here to pin us up in reservations. These are the ones that have come out here to take control and to stake out their own claims and to begin plowing up Mother Earth. And so, no, of course they didn't see any of that, because Lewis and Clark weren't doing any of that. Lewis and Clark wanted to get along with the Indians. They wanted to trade with the Indians. They wanted the Indians to help them get over those mountains. They needed the Montana and the Idaho Indians if they were going to establish a commercial link between the east coast of the United States and the Pacific Ocean, where all those furs were that they so badly wanted. So no, they did not represent a threat.